So today we're looking at AMD versus NVIDIA in VR using Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024. From NVIDIA we've got the 4080 Super, and from AMD we have the 7900 XTX. Now, in general, these cards aren't a million miles away from each other on paper, but there are key ways in which both cards differ, and that can have a direct impact on how Flight Simulator 2024 performs. Virtual reality in Microsoft Flight Simulator is an incredible experience, but it's no secret that it really pushes your hardware. For example, with the Pimax Crystal Light, we have a whopping 2880 by 2880 pixels per eye. That is more than 16 million pixels. For context, a 4K TV has about 8.3 million pixels. So yeah, VR can be quite the handful. So the question is, which gives you the best performance in VR, Team Red or Team Green? Before we find out though, we need to thank Pimax for lending us one of their Pimax Crystal Light headsets and for sponsoring this video. If you're in the market for a Pimax Crystal Light headset, pop this date in your diaries. On June the 16th, 2025, between 6 PM and midnight UTC, using the affiliate link in the video description along with the code AIRNOT10 at checkout, you can get yourself a 10% discount off the upfront cost of a Pimax Crystal Light headset. If you're watching this afterwards, you can still use the affiliate link in the description and just use the code AIRNOT, and that will get you 3% off the upfront cost of the Pimax Crystal Light headset. Thanks again to Pimax for sponsoring this video and for loaning us one of their Crystal Light headsets. Right, let's dive in because there's a lot here. First things first, the system we'll be testing these GPUs on consists of a 5800 X3D paired with 64 gigs of DDR4 3600 CL18 memory. Unless otherwise specified, we're going to be running the sim using the high-end VR graphics preset, and we're also running the OpenXR toolkit in the background. So on the left, we've got the 7900 XTX, and on the right, we have the 4080 Super. All things considered, around about 35-ish FPS from the 7900 XTX isn't bad, considering the 16 million plus pixels we're pushing right now without any help from upscaling. The 4080 Super is trailing a little, only by kind of 2 or 3 frames most of the time, but it seems consistent throughout the test run. One thing I did notice on the 4080 Super was how it was just a little bit more stuttery. I noticed it quite significantly on the climb out of the airfield. Another thing of note is that the AMD card seems to be using less VRAM. This flight data was recorded and then played back for testing purposes, so we have the same flight running each time, albeit just with different GPUs installed, and the only variable is my head movement, but that is a definite gig or so less on the AMD card, which is kind of bad really, as the AMD card is the one that's got more VRAM to spare, yet it's using less, so that's a bit of a weird one from NVIDIA there. If we introduce some DLSS upscaling for the 4080 Super and FSR upscaling for the 7900 XTX, both in their quality modes, we can see that we've got a little bit of a lift to performance, both cards now getting in the neighborhood of 40 FPS. It's worth noting here that the stuttering issue that we experienced with the 4080 Super went away once I introduced DLSS upscaling. If we drop the upscalers down to their respective performance modes, we see an even bigger increase in performance yet again. The 7900 XTX now breaking the 50 FPS barrier sometimes. The 4080 Super is doing well too, at around 50 FPS, though it does feel like it's ever so slightly on the lower side. It feels like you're more likely to see a high 40s out of the 4080 Super. Even so, that's not bad going at all. It's doing really well. Now, all we've done so far is talk about performance numbers, but there's another side to the coin, and that is how it looks visually. Due to the way that video footage is captured from my headset into my recording software, I'm not entirely convinced that you're going to be able to see the levels of detail that I can see when I've got the headset on. Therefore, you're going to kind of have to take my word for a lot of what I'm about to say regarding the visual fidelity with FSR versus DLSS. But I think it's very fair to say that DLSS upscaling is far superior to FSR upscaling. When we're running without any upscaling from DLSS or FSR, we're using TAA, and the sim then defaults to running at a render resolution of 80% in order to take some of the load off of the GPU. I did try upping it to 100%, and well, let's just say I now fully understand why it defaults to 80. The thing is though, at 80%, it can kind of look a little bit prickly around the edges sometimes. I'm not convinced FSR in quality mode makes things particularly worse in the Cessna. It still looked pretty good to me, and I was very glad to get the FPS boost. But using DLSS 4 upscaling in quality mode, now that we have it thanks to Sim Update 2, it looked very, very good. Dare I say it, maybe better than running with TAA at the 80% render resolution. NVIDIA's DLSS magic strikes again here, it would seem. One drawback to both FSR and DLSS is that they tend to make the glass cockpits of our airliners look a bit smeary. You can see here, even with DLSS 4, which boasted greater clarity for objects in motion, it still struggles. As a result, when I'm not flying in VR, if I'm just on my TV, I leave upscaling off and rely on TAA. However, I am a realist. I understand that when it comes to VR, we're pushing a lot of pixels and we probably need to be a bit more accepting of that compromise. And on that basis, I would struggle to advise you to leave upscaling off, be that NVIDIA's DLSS or AMD's FSR. In my opinion, DLSS 3 upscaling was superior to AMD's FSR 3 upscaling, and that lead has now been dramatically increased with the introduction of DLSS 4. Now, AMD has revealed FSR 4, however, we can't use that with the 7900 XTX card. That's exclusive to the new 9070 class of AMD GPUs. I haven't tried it myself, but the general feeling seems to be that it's kind of in line and rivals DLSS 3, meaning NVIDIA are kind of still one step ahead with DLSS 4, which has kind of become a bit of a theme, hasn't it? As for the visual quality, when we were running the upscalers in their performance mode, NVIDIA's DLSS 4 still does a pretty damn good job here. Thanks to DLSS 4's new Transformer AI models, I found that DLSS 4 in performance mode isn't a million miles away from DLSS 3 in quality mode. So whereas I used to avoid performance mode in DLSS 3, I feel like it's now something that is very much on the table thanks to DLSS 4. Sadly though, I'm afraid the same can't be said for FSR 3. Therefore, all things considered, in terms of upscaling technologies, it points to NVIDIA as the visual clarity is without doubt much better. AMD's solution isn't awful, but there's no way I can't give NVIDIA the points here. Okay, it's time for the worst case scenario now. It's time to jump into our Fenix A320, a highly demanding study level airliner, and take it to Edinburgh. That is Edinburgh V2 by Pyreegue, no less, one of the most demanding sceneries in the sim. The plan is to taxi from the end of runway 06 to a gate, so we'll see what each card can do. We'll start with the 7900 XTX. We won't be doing side-by-sides for reasons that will soon become clear. Okay, using the high-end graphics preset, we're sort of in the high 20s here with the 7900 XTX running with no upscaling, so just TAA at 80% render resolution. And look at that VRAM, that is approaching 17 gigabytes used. FPS occasionally dips down into the low 20s. This isn't particularly surprising to me, as even when we're playing around without VR, this kind of behavior isn't unusual. Maybe some FSR can help. So going to FSR in quality mode, and we're still not in a particularly great position, are we? I'd go as far to say that it hasn't really helped at all. Okay, so what if we go to FSR in performance mode? And again, not really a lot of difference there, is there? This tells me that we are likely main thread limited due to the complexity of the scenery and also the airliner we're running. Occasionally that CPU limit does get out of the way and we see something approaching 30 FPS, but it's not overly stable. We can get around this though by dropping our settings to kind of lighten the load on the CPU. So instead of running the high-end graphics preset, we're going to drop to the medium graphics preset. So we'll start again with the medium graphics preset, no upscaling, so just TAA. It's better, but I would say it's also not great. We're still struggling to get past the 30 FPS mark consistently, but it does seem like a definite improvement. And look at that VRAM usage, still up in the 15 gig range. That is wild. If we use some FSR upscaling in quality mode, we're still pretty much hard stuck at just under 30 FPS again. Once again, likely CPU limited. And again, it's not unusual for me to get FPS like this when I'm here on the ground at Edinburgh when I'm streaming without using VR. So yeah, this is clearly a result of being main thread limited. And just to prove that point, let's do the same thing but running with FSR in performance mode. And yeah, basically it's the same. So what have we proved here? Other than, well, I could really use a 9800X 3D upgrade. Well, let's pop in the 4080 Super and find out. So 4080 Super is in, and starting out on the high-end preset running TAA, you can see that the 4080 Super doesn't even get much of a chance to get started, as we're immediately blowing past its 16 gigs of VRAM, causing our FPS to hit the floor. For those looking at my VRAM usage, thinking, but you're at 15 gigabytes on a 16 gig card, how is that running over? It's not that simple. Sadly, the sim doesn't get access to all 16 gigs of the VRAM on the 4080, as Windows needs to take some for itself, plus any other applications you might have running in the background. Okay, so what about dropping from the high-end preset to medium while keeping it TAA? And no, that's no good either. We're still out of VRAM, only just, but yeah, you can see the results for yourself. So what about if we go to the low end the low end. All right, let's go to the low end preset. And yeah, okay, finally we've got something approaching playable, back up to our just shy of 30 FPS that we saw with the 7900 XTX, and our VRAM usage is now mostly under control, using about 90% of what's available, though that is still a bit close to the limit for my liking, I've got to be honest. So what about medium with some DLSS? Maybe we could get away with that. I don't know. Starting in quality mode, I would say the answer is no, based on this footage. But what about if we go to performance mode? That's actually a little bit better, isn't it? Presumably because the lower render resolution of DLSS in performance versus quality. Even so, seeing our VRAM sitting at around 90% still kind of weirds me out a little bit. It feels like even though it's okay for right now, that could all change in a heartbeat, and I can't tell you how comforting it is to see a big fat 24 gigs of VRAM in the 7900 XTX. Now I know the FPS wasn't that great as we were taxiing around with the 7900 XTX, but at least we were able to taxi, and in fairness to the 7900 XTX, that poor performance we were seeing was actually being caused by the CPU. So what are we to conclude? Well, given what we've just seen, I would really struggle right now in June of 2025 to recommend the 4080 Super for VR and for 4K non-VR gaming for that matter. It's not the first time we've had trouble on this channel. Think back to when we flew the Airbus A380 from Dubai back to Heathrow. By the time we got to Heathrow, our VRAM was shot and we were like flying a slideshow basically. And that's all due to its 16 gigabytes of VRAM. And it's a shame because the 4080 Super's got all of those NVIDIA features that we've come to enjoy, such as DLSS upscaling and their frame generation technology, which frankly are the best in the business. And the GPU core itself is strong, it's just so massively let down by a lack of VRAM. And the same goes for the 5080. That still has 16 gigs of VRAM. I've heard rumours that maybe there's a 5080 Super potentially on the way, which might have 24 gigs of VRAM. Which in my eyes is what the 5080 non-super should have been from the get-go, but I don't know, that's not confirmed and it could be a way out anyway. And all of that right there is why I purchased the AMD 7900 XTX, not because I desperately wanted an AMD card, but because I wanted 24 gigs of VRAM and it was the cheapest way for me to get there. I got mine barely used for £600, which I appreciate is an amazing deal that others are perhaps unlikely to get for themselves on the used market. But even brand new, you can get them for around £800, which I know is a lot, but when you compare it to the 4090/5090, it's looking much more sensible. And it put in a good performance today, only being slowed down at Edinburgh by my aging 5800 X3D CPU. So in an ideal world, I would prefer to have a modern NVIDIA card with 24 gigs of VRAM, but the 7900 XTX is hard to ignore right now at its current price point. Unless Asobo can get this VRAM issue under control, or unless NVIDIA make a 24 gig card that's, around the £1,000 mark, I think it's got to be the 7900 XTX for now. I mean, obviously, if you're already on a 4090 or a 5090, you're fine. Carry on. Enjoy the awesome card. I'll just be over here being jealous. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and thanks again to Pimax for sponsoring this video and for making it possible by loaning us one of their Pimax Crystal Light headsets. Let me know in the comments if you've got any questions, but until next time, you will take the very best care of yourselves, be good to each other, and as always, happy flying.